The Chesapeake Bay was once brimmed with life. In the 1600s, ships had to navigate their way through the waters due to the mass oyster reefs. The bay water was clear enough for Indians to be able to walk out and pluck the oysters from the beds. Oysters were very abundant. Bay life was plentiful. Rockfish, manatees, river otters, gray whales, dolphins, sea turtles, giant sturgeons, and sharks roamed the Chesapeake. Schools of fish swam through the water as gulls dropped down into the bay to retrieve their evening meal. Not only did oysters filter this beautiful estuary, but they also supplied land with food and jobs. 150 years ago, the number of oysters in the Chesapeake Bay were enough to filter the water in 3.5 days. Today, there are only enough to filter the bay once in 100 days, stated Dr. Roger Mann, an oyster biologist. Oysters are filters for the bay, and as they decrease, so does the water quality. The magnitude of the decline raises concerns about potential for continued loss of natural oyster beds throughout much of Maryland waters. We recommend a moratorium on fishing until reefs and self-sustaining populations are restored, stated Michael J. Wilberg, an oyster biologist. By the time the state officials and environmentalists realized the impact of the watermen on the oyster in the late 1900s, it was too late. The oyster population decrease was due to the watermen's neglected responsibilities.
I have noticed since I've been here, and this is informal, we have seen less healthy oysters out on the bar than when I first started. But that could be due to a lot of different factors. So for that reason, I'd say that, I think it's important to look at a larger perspective.
The fisheries have the right to harvest oysters, but also the responsibility to protect the natural oyster beds. Kate Livy, an educator for the Maritime Museum, stated, "Overharvesting and diseases cause the oyster population to drop to 1% of what it once was." The first hint of overharvesting was thought to have begun in 1634 in Jamestown. Since then, the harvests have grown due to the abundance of the population. In the 1800s, the dredge, a new technology used to scrape the bottom of the bay for oysters, was created to make harvesting simpler. The dredge had made harvests larger, but the beds were destroyed. One of the reasons for the decrease was that the beds were too torn up to plant for spat to grow on. In the 1880s, the 28,000 watermen harvested over 10 million oyster bushels. Today, with less than 16,000 watermen out on the Chesapeake, there is a harvest of not even 1,000 bushels. This is the most immense drop in the history of the oyster. At the moment, the oysters are almost extinct. In 1883, an oyster packer writes to the Baltimore Sun as follows: "As the session of legislature is near at hand, I deem it a duty to call attention to the oyster industry of Baltimore and of Maryland. The packing industry of Baltimore is fast being driven away by bad legislation regarding oysters. An industry which claims the attention of packers 6 months of the year and gives employment to at least 15,000 of her poorest citizens during this time. As will be seen by the following statistics, the amount of oysters used in Baltimore amounts to a large sum, and if proper legislation were enacted, it could be doubled and even tripled." Legislation was made to put industry first, not to protect the bay. In the few efforts to save the oyster in the 1950s, the state officials decided to bring the thriving Virginian oyster to the Maryland waters, clueless to the fact that the deadly disease MSX had infected those oysters. This settlement resulted in 80 to 90% of the remaining oyster beds being wiped out. Another example of this faulty legislation was in 1865, when Maryland allowed dredging again, when dredging tears up the oyster reefs. It was thought that a benefit of dredging was that the silt, preventing the growth of spat, was dusted off during this process. But the silt would continue to fall back on the spat. The faulty legislation here is the whole idea of dredging in the first place. Dredging created overharvesting with its new technology of scraping the bottom. Aquaculture is taking place in the Chesapeake at the moment, a program that is made up of oysters made by scientists for commercial and replenishing the bay. There are two groups: triploids, which are not reproductive but grow 3 times as fast and are used for commercial fishing, and diploids, which are used to replenish the bay with their reproductive factor. This recent effort has helped, but many environmentalists believe that it may be too late.
So this is where we grow the oysters from babies into their maturity, and then we'll give them back to these outside organizations that turn them over to these state sanctuaries. The biggest problem in the Chesapeake Bay is people, right? The more people that move into the watershed, the more pressure there is on the water quality and the land. The more people are flushing their toilets, the more people are fertilizing their yards and their farm fields and driving all over the place and exhaust in the air and yada yada. So all of that ends up in the bay, and then you've got the 1% of oysters left that are trying to clean it all out, and we're putting more oysters in, and we're still harvesting them. So the outlook for the oysters is
Everybody's opinion was that it was an endless supply. Was Carol Smith's response to my question, was anybody motivated when you lived on the bay to help the oyster? Carol Smith lived on Solomon's Island in the 1950s and told me that the government even tested bombs by dropping them in the bay. This had harmed all the bay life, and everyone was clueless on the impact. She said that there was good clarity back then, but there has been a lot of pollution buildup since that time. Smith had used to be able to see clearly through 5 feet of water, but now she can't see anywhere. Today, though, the citizens have put forth many efforts to save the bay. Kate Livy takes an ecology cruise to examine the oyster's health. Over the years, though, she finds that the oysters are still getting worse in health. Many laws have been passed recently due to the realization that manure and fertilizer buildup has a negative impact on the water quality. The Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 to limit the amount of nutrients that flow into the bay. It has been proven by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation that the 3 main types of nitrogen pollution that the bay is prone to are industrial pollution, manure, and fertilizers. The oyster population decrease was influenced by the abused rights and responsibilities of the watermen who overharvested, legislatures who put industry first in the 1800s with little time to help the oysters now, and citizens whose actions negatively impacted the water quality. The oyster management of the Chesapeake Bay is crucial to the health of the bay life around it. The bay used to be filled with oyster reefs that colonists had to navigate through carefully. Thomas Gulliver stated in 1676, "Here are such plenty of oysters that they may load ships with them." Unfortunately, that is not the case today. Due to overharvesting, poor legislation, and careless responses from the citizens, the oyster population is now 1% of what it once was.